Well, just 2 more shopping days until Christmas. Or guys, just 1 more day until it's time to get serious about shopping for Christmas, right? Just remember 2 words, guys. Gift, receipt. Gift, receipt. Remember those 2 words and you'll be fine. Actually, I have a lot of good advice for buying gifts for your wives. If you need it, just come ask me. Things like don't ever ask if you get her clothing, does it fit? Don't ask that question. Nothing good can come from that question. In fact, you should buy a size smaller than you think she needs. Trust me on this. And don't buy her something from Lowe's or Home Depot. In fact, the more uncomfortable you are in the store, the better chance you're going to find something she will like. There's a direct correlation there. Trust me. Hey, if you have a Bible or on your device, turn it over to Philippians chapter 1. It is good to be together. It is good to worship God. It is good to remember Jesus and who He is and what He's done. I appreciate Sylvan's time around the table with us and directing our thoughts. It's so important for us to realize that Jesus isn't just a character in a storybook, that the Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. And because He did that, because He lived among us, He understands us, and He wants us to know He understands us. And because He dwelt among us, He went to the cross and died for us. And because He did that, God raised Him from the dead. That same power is at work in our lives every day. And certainly that power will raise us one day, on the day, to live with Him forever. And we give thanks to God for that. In a conference a few years ago, a New York Times writer named David Brooks was talking about how we live in a very achievement-oriented society. That success is really the measure and the pursuit of virtually everyone. And he said we live by what he called 2 different sets of virtues. The resume virtues, these are the things that we do to contribute to the marketplace, things that we would put on a resume. He says we also live by something he calls the eulogy virtues, things that we want people to say about us at our funeral. And he says most people know that the eulogy virtues are more important than the resume virtues, but we end up spending more time and more energy on the resume virtues. That certainly was the case for a man named Jack. Jack had quite a stellar career. He was a salesperson, and when it came to resume virtues, he had it all. In fact, I saw on his wall in his hallway this huge framed certificate of Salesman of the Year. He won all the sales awards for his company, all the incentives, all the trips, all the certificates, all the trophies. He won them all. He poured himself into his career. But when it came to eulogy virtues, to use David Brooks's words, there wasn't too much going on for Jack. In fact, when he died a few years ago, there were just a handful of people there at his funeral. I would estimate maybe 15 people. 2 of those people were his grown daughters who were basically estranged from their father, but showed up there to say farewell. They could only think of a couple of nice things to say about their dad. They said he was committed, he was dedicated to his job. No question. And they said he always dressed sharply. In fact, at the funeral, I kid you not, they had ZZ Top's Sharp Dressed Man played at the funeral. Young people, if you don't know who ZZ Top is, that's probably a good thing. Just think about the TV duck people with guitars, and then you're pretty much there. But you know, something happens when we approach the end of our lives, as far as we know it could be the end of our lives. Something happens in us to cause us to reflect on the significance of our lives. What was my life all about? What is my life all about? We ask those types of questions. We want to know our purpose. We want to know, did it mean something? What was it all about? What did how I lived my life say about what was important to me? What did it say about my purpose in life? I think the Apostle Paul had some of those moments, some of those reflective moments as he neared the end of his life. I think he looked back over his life, especially his life as an ambassador of Christ. And he asked that question, what has my life been all about? And when he writes this letter to the church in Philippi, he is in prison in Rome, probably on house arrest, which means he is literally chained to a guard. Now, he has a little bit of freedom. He can write, obviously, and he can possibly have people into that place to visit with them, but he is not free. And at this time, Nero is the Roman emperor. And if you know anything about Nero, you know he was violently against Christianity. That he would actually kill Christians for entertainment. He would tie them to posts in the town, set them on fire as human torches to provide light to the town. He had all these warped, crazy things he would do to torture Christians. Paul is in prison. There's a good chance in Paul's mind that he knows this is it. That if he doesn't die there in prison, he may die at the hand of his executioner. And so as he contemplates what is next, he thinks about what is now. And it becomes very clear to him, his purpose, his meaning. As he considers the splendor of the next life, he reflects on his purpose in this life. And so look at Philippians chapter 1, the second part of verse 18. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. Let me stop right there because already Paul has said a couple of things that just are startling. Paul says, I will continue to rejoice. Paul, wait a second. Do you know where you are? Do you know what is likely to happen to you? You are in prison. This doesn't look good for you. Paul knew all about hardship. And yet he says, I can rejoice. That's the theme many people think of the entire letter we call Philippians. Joy and rejoicing. How does he do that? How can he say that? Paul, how can you really mean that you rejoice even in your suffering, even in your hardship? Because Paul's perspective transcended his circumstances. Let me say that again. Paul's mindset, his perspective, it transcended his circumstances. He could see not just through them, but over them to what God was doing, to who God is. And so he says, I can rejoice, even when times are difficult, even when things aren't going like I wish they were. I can find joy because there's something deeper, there's something more meaningful, more significant. But at the same time, Paul recognizes that he is in a very difficult situation. And so he says that all of this is leading toward his deliverance. His deliverance. Paul is, in fact, engulfed by hardship. And so he borrows a line from the Bible's poster child for suffering. If you think about suffering in the Bible, who do you think about? If you're familiar with the Bible at all, you probably think about Job, right? The Old Testament character Job. And so Paul borrows a line from Job. Job, who is trying to cling to his faith amid intense suffering, he makes the same prediction. In Job 13, verse 16, indeed, this will turn out for my deliverance. Well, Paul, what do you mean? Are you saying that God is going to come and unlock that chain and get rid of those guards and he's going to set you free and open those doors and you can just be free to go? Well, certainly God could do that. Paul knew that firsthand. But I'm not sure Paul is banking on that happening in this situation. When Paul speaks of his deliverance, he has something bigger in mind, something even more substantial. Paul knows that ultimately he will be released. He will be released from the struggles of his life, the troubles and pain of imprisonment, the injustice at the hands of his accusers, the difficulty of his circumstances. And even death, life's final assault on us, will not defeat him, but will deliver him to something even better. And so Paul says, yes, through all of this suffering, I rejoice. And in all of this suffering, I will be delivered. And I may not be set free. I may not be plucked out of these difficult circumstances. In fact, I may die. But I will still be delivered in and through death. What a statement of faith. Well, the Philippian Christians to whom Paul is writing are concerned about him. They know he's in prison. And by extension, they are concerned about themselves. If this is happening to Paul, this could happen to us. They need to hear Paul's word of hope. They need to hear his perspective on life and death. And so do we. And so Paul continues in verse 20. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now as always Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Paul says, until death is my reality, I have a life to live. And his life is to be lived for the exaltation of Christ. He says, Christ will be exalted in my body. That word in the original text means to enlarge, to celebrate, to esteem highly, to magnify. Think about a magnifying glass. Paul says, I want you to be able to see my life or my death through a magnifying glass so that it's not me that's bigger, but it's Christ that becomes bigger. That you see him when you see me. Paul continues in verse 21. For to me, Paul says, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me. Paul seems somewhat confused here, doesn't he? We hear what sounds like a mixed bag of uncertainty from Paul. He says, I'm sure, but I'm not sure. I'm deciding, but I'm not deciding. I want to live, but I want to die. He says, I'm torn between the two. Boy, there's not many people who can say that, is there? There's not many people that when you ask the question, all things being equal, would you choose rather to die or to live? Right? If someone asked you that choice, what would you say? Well, first you'd want to know, is this a threat or are you just asking me? Right? No, just asking you. All things being equal, do you want to live or do you want to die? Well, that's an easy one. It's a no-brainer. I want to live. Put me down for living. That's what I want to do. Right? I mean, isn't that how you would answer that question? And I wonder, because we would answer that question that way, and not just that way, but very strongly that way, what it says about our lives. Why do we cling so dearly and strongly and firmly to this life? What is it about this life? I have a feeling it's some of those resume virtues, right? It's some of those things that the world says is so important. Success and happiness. Fulfillment. Sure, we choose life. And I wonder what it says about our lives. And then you contrast that with the short-sighted mindset that many of us have. You contrast Paul's mindset with our mindset. The fact that he is embracing death, not just as a real possibility, but as something that he would welcome. It tells us about his perspective. He honestly sees benefit in both living and dying. If I die, that just means I get to be with Christ sooner. If I live, that just means I get to work for him even more. Either way, in death or in life, Christ will be exalted. Either way, Paul belongs to Christ. Either way, He will not be ashamed of Jesus. For Paul, it is, in fact, a win-win situation. As Paul faces death, and he considers the measure of his own life, as he reflects on what his life has been all about, he makes this very simple statement, this famous statement in verse 21. He says, "For to me, to live is Christ. If I'm not dying yet, then I see the purpose of my life as being Christ." He says, my life has no other purpose beyond Christ. My life is rooted in no other source of value and worth than Christ. My life is for the glory and the purposes of nothing except Christ. My life, Paul says, is lived in and consumed by Christ alone. Here's what I want you to hear this morning. I want you to know, I want you to believe that God created you to live in Christ and for Christ. Do you understand that? God made you to live in Christ and for Him. When Jesus said that He is the way, the truth, and the life, He wasn't talking about His life. He was talking about yours. Just as Jesus is the source of life, which we talked about last week, Jesus is the purpose in life. And it doesn't matter what you do for a living. Whatever you do for a living, your life is to be about Christ, for His glory, for His honor. That means everything you do, every relationship you have, every conversation needs to be infused with the teachings and the heart and the life and the purpose of Christ. Paul wrote the Christians in Colossae something very similar to this. He tells them to look beyond their circumstances, to have eternal vision, to set their minds on things above. Then he continues in Colossians 3, verse 4, when Christ, who is your life. That's a weird way to say it, isn't it? When Christ, who is your life, when He appears, then you also will appear with Him in glory. You see, for Paul, the equation is very simple. Life equals Christ. That's it. Life equals Christ. He says something very similar to that, even to the church in Galatia, Galatians 2:20. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. That means I am dead. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. You see, when we are in Christ, there isn't a secular side of my life and a spiritual side, right? We can't divide it that way. You know, my job is sort of what I do and what I have to do. And then I have my family and church life and some friendships. And, well, I do have some friendships over here too, and we divide it. No. For Paul, he says, life equals Christ. Anything that's a part of your life should exalt Christ, should honor Him, should be rooted in His life, in His teachings, in His heart. Paul says, if I go on living, it means fruitful labor. Christ at work in me, making much of Christ, revealing Christ to others, submitting my will, my life to Him and His purpose for me. This time of year, we hear that song, Mary, Did You Know? I was in the store the other day and I heard that song. Mary, did you know? Yes, she knew. She knew. An angel told her. Now, she may have not known all the specifics, but she knew because an angel said, you will bear a son. He is to be called Jesus, and He will be the Son of the Most High. And you know what Mary says? Mary says, whatever you want to do, God, I'm yours. The way you've described it, that's how it's going to happen. You see, for Mary, it was submitting her life, her expectations, her agenda to that of the Lord's. Whatever you want, do with me what you will. Even when that means she'll be treated probably not in very good ways by some people around her. After all, she's not married yet, and here she is having a baby. That's okay, God, whatever you want. However you explain it, however you describe it, that's how it's going to happen. And so let me ask you a question. Sort of a fill-in-the-blank question. If you had to sum up your life with one word, not a manifesto, not a biography, not a book, not a page, not a sentence, not a phrase, one word. If you had to sum up your life with one word, what would you say? How would you capture the fullness of your life with one word? Paul said, "For to me, to live is Christ." How about you? What would you say? For to me, to live is blank. Some might say, well, it's pretty easy. For me, to live is happiness. I want to be happy. I deserve to be happy. I want to make my kids happy, my grandkids happy. Hey, I want to make everybody happy. Let's all be happy. Is that the ultimate measure of life? Some might say, well, for me, to live is comfort. I want to be comfortable. For me, to live is security. I want to not have to worry. I want to have enough money in the bank. I want to have enough retirement. I don't want to worry. For me to really live is to be secure. For others, it might be for me to live is to be in control. I have to have control of every situation because then I know how it's going to turn out. For me to live is power, is influence. For me to live is approval. I need everyone to like me. I need them to say good things about me and to me. How would you fill in the blank? For me to live is success or accomplishments or achievements. Probably for most of us, however we filled in that blank, we would go on to the next part and say, for me to live is blank and to die is, and if we were honest, we would say it's loss. Because dying means giving up on what's in the blank. Dying means that is cut short. Right? What would the people who know you best say about you? What word would they use to put in the blank for you? Oh, for him? For her? Oh, for them to live, it's blank. What would they say? Too many people want to be a Christian, but don't want Christ to disrupt their lives. They are covert Christians. I mean, if push comes to shove, then I'll let it be known, but it's easier just to sort of fly under the radar. It's easier just to buy into a set of beliefs that really don't transform anything in my life. It's just sort of, that's the box I check. Because we know, if we're honest with ourselves, and we say, for to me, to live is Christ, we know that means making some changes, giving up some things. It means putting His ways constantly before my ways. It means, as Paul says, fruitful labor for Him, for His glory. And why do we struggle with that? There's probably many reasons why. For some of us, it's just what people might say or think. And I want you to notice what Paul says. Remember verse 20? He says, I eagerly expect and hope that I will not be ashamed, that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now as always Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Paul says, I am not going to let what other people think of me determine how I live my life. He says, my prayer, my hope, my resolve is that I will not be ashamed. It's not the first time Paul's mentioned this. Remember in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, he makes this great declaration, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. Are you ashamed to fill in that blank with Christ? Are you worried more about what other people think? Are you concerned about the changes that it will demand on your life? Are you bothered by replacing one of those other words like comfort or success or even family, good things sometimes, with Christ? It's true, only about 15 people gathered to say farewell to Jack, the sharp-dressed man who poured himself into his career. And 2 of those 15 were his grown daughters who could not contain their resentment for him. But as sad as Jack's story is, you need to know that there is actually more to his story. Why only 15 people gathered to say farewell to him, I believe that a host of heavenly angels gathered to welcome him into eternity. You see, because about a year before his death, God sent a good man named Gil to go to Jack and to share the gospel with him. And together, Gil and I baptized Jack into Christ. And no matter what happened before that day, from then on, for Jack to live was Christ, and to die was gain. It's never too late. But don't wait. Don't wait. Where do you find purpose in life? If you were honest, how would you fill in that blank? For to me, to live is what? What is it? I hope it's Christ. Maybe today you want to make that same declaration of faith that Paul made. For me to live is Christ. Maybe you want to make that same decision Jack made and give your life to Christ, be baptized into Christ, raised up to live for His purpose, for His glory. We would love to help you and to celebrate that decision with you. Or maybe today we can support you and encourage you and pray for you. Certainly we'd be happy to do that. We're going to stand and sing a song. We have a couple of shepherds and their wives in the parlor right behind me. It's a little room. You can go out any of these doors, make your way around there, and they'd be happy to pray with you and encourage you. Or you can come down to the front, and we would be glad to receive you. There's something we can do today for you. We invite you to come as we stand and sing.